Sometimes, if we're not careful, our roots can poison the fruit we bear. All of us are a product of our roots. Sometimes we are who we are because we embrace the roots we came from. So me, for example, I am proud to take after my parents and my grandparents. And sometimes we are who we are because we are resisting roots we had. So for me, I know I will never be a smoker because I know what that did to generations past. The roots define us in the same way that roots build community. I understand as a nonprofit leader that my roots led me to this choice today to lead in the ways that I do. But right now, I gotta tell you, it is so hard to be a leader in the nonprofit sector in this environment. The more I speak to other leaders in this community, the more I understand that I am not alone, and that the struggles that we face as leaders right now in the social service sector are profound. Just in 2025, the administration plans to reduce social service spending by more than $1 trillion in the next 10 years. It's hard to be in this moment. And it occurs to me that because I derive so much strength from my own roots, that maybe the nonprofit sector could derive some strength from better understanding the roots of the system as a whole. And so I decided to embark on a journey to better understand what are the roots of our nation that cause the behaviors we see today, what are the roots of the nonprofit sector, and what role does the nonprofit sector play in all of this today? So I embarked on my research journey. We have to start with the acknowledgement that a taproot to this nation rests in slavery, the great divide that caused this country to turn against itself in war. Now, at that time, the nonprofit sector didn't yet exist, and it wouldn't be for 30 more years before we would see the sector actually start to develop. Now, at this time, between 1900 and 1930, we started to see nonprofits grow, donors grow, foundations grow, but still, government wasn't investing yet in the sector. So it's hard to compare that time to today. So I fast-forwarded into the Great Depression. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected in 1933, and he introduced to our nation something he called the New Deal. Now, the New Deal was a system of policies that aimed to infuse the economy with money into social services. So he needed nonprofits to carry out his objectives. And this was the first time we ever saw public-private partnership or investment from the government into nonprofits. So we were starting to get closer to the sector that we now see today. This was also the beginning of things like Social Security. This is when we saw federal housing work begin, public works. So it was a huge investment from the government, and it was the first time we saw big government, the first time ever this country had experienced it, and the first time this country had to pay for it. So in addition to having big government, we also started to see high taxes. So high, in fact, that all income above $3 million in today's money was taxed at more than 90%. So we had big government and high taxes. And here's where I got confused, because what we're hearing today from the government is the reason why they might want to pull back funding from social services is because our founding fathers were against big government and high taxes. So I thought here somewhere there would have to be some sort of pushback. So I searched and I couldn't find it. There was no uproar, there was no reducing of funding for social services, and so I fast-forwarded onto the civil rights era. So some of those nonprofits that started at the turn of the century, they got really strong, and now they were leading the charge in the civil rights movement. They were successful in getting landmark legislation passed. It was a momentous time for our country. And at the same time, our president, Lyndon B. Johnson, or LBJ, started what he called the Great Society, which in some ways was similar to the New Deal era in that it was another large infusion of money through nonprofits into social services. LBJ needed nonprofits to carry out his priorities. And LBJ didn't dance around states' rights like previous presidents had done. In fact, LBJ used nonprofits to
to circumvent states that were pushing back against his policies. But why would the states push back against his policies when they hadn't pushed back in the New Deal era? As it turns out, Great Society programs were designed to cross racial lines in their administration of programs. And so here's where we see the difference between the New Deal era and the Great Society era. The New Deal era was infamous for its redlining that prohibited Black families from accessing federal housing subsidies. It was also famous for excluding Black families from Social Security, excluding them from the GI Bill. So while the New Deal was successful in getting this country out of poverty, it was only successful in raising up white families while it froze Black families in time. And it grew racial disparities in wealth to a profound degree. The Great Society era was intending to rectify that and to uplift Black families intentionally with the services that it provided. And now it makes sense why the New Deal era policies came and went without protest, but the Great Society policies required the National Guard to enforce. So while the government was implementing these incredible racial justice strategies, our foundation sector, part of the nonprofit sector, was out of the mix. Our foundations, only 1% of them were dedicating any of their funds to things that they deemed controversial. That included racial justice work. And of the funds they contributed, they were only donating 0.1% of their outlays. So it really wasn't a major player in the game at this point, until 1965, when the Ford Foundation jumped into the game. Now, the Ford Foundation was a major foundation at the time, just as it is today, and they committed 40% of their outlays to the civil rights movement. This was a huge investment. They were contributing to activities across the country, and it was wildly successful, including get out the vote efforts in Black communities that ended up working. And we saw Cleveland get their first Black mayor this way. Legislators, and specifically white supremacist legislators, were furious. They couldn't stop LBJ, and they couldn't stop the Great Society, but they could stop foundations, and so they did. Our legislators decried foundations of waste, fraud, and abuse. They demanded investigations of foundations, and then after the investigations, they passed legislation that stopped foundations from being able to engage at all in political activity. They also heaped on all of these regulations onto foundations that were very expensive and made it very risky for foundations to invest in the way they had been before. And foundations fell in line. So foundations now pass their risk down to nonprofits. It used to be that foundations would say, we love your mission, here's our money, use it as you see fit. But after this legislation passed, foundations started restricting their money and saying, spend my money how I tell you to, and it better not be to support Black voters. At this point, foundations were back out of the mix, and it was onto the government. Fortunately, after LBJ came and went, the new presidents weren't able to dismantle the Great Society, and so we continue to see racial justice progress. So for example, in 1965, the white to Black wealth ratio disparity was 8-to-1. By 1979, that had dropped down to 5-to-1. We saw Black poverty cut in half by then. We were making great progress toward racial justice until the election of President Reagan. So civil rights era, your roots are coming to bear, here comes your poison. At this point, we knew that we weren't able to say explicitly racist things in society anymore. And so we were communicating in ways to imply racist things through language called dog whistles, like the welfare queen trope. This also applied to policies. So President Reagan was famous for his war on drugs. The war on drugs, at face value, might not have looked like it was meant to be explicitly racist, but in practice, it was profoundly racist. By 1987, the war on drugs resulted in 2 out of every 3 Black adult men under the age of 30 being arrested. It was incredibly racist. And at the same time, the Reagan administration started withdrawing money from social services to the tune of 25% almost overnight. And now we can see great similarities between what was happening in the 80s and what's happening today. In the 80s, when there was this sudden loss of social service money, our nonprofits fell in line. So nonprofits now, trying to keep themselves whole at the expense of people they served, nonprofits in the 1980s started charging fees for the services that they were running. This ended up excluding the lowest income community members that they were serving, which, under these racist policies, were becoming more and more black. And they pivoted instead their services now to the middle class, who could afford the fees, who, under these policies, was becoming more and more white. At the same time, nonprofits also started charging themselves to Medicaid to try to get federal money in a different way. The problem with Medicaid is that you need to provide a diagnosis in order to get money from them. So here we had social justice, racial justice organizations that had been focusing on systemic racism, now individually pathologizing people in order to make money. And it was a complete mindset shift for the entire sector. Now our foundations at the same time were exiting many of their executives who'd had interest in social welfare and were replacing them with people with expertise in making money, in investments, and in holding people to compliance, because compliance was king, and the king was kind of racist. So by 1989, what we were seeing was a complete reversal of the progress that we had made by 1979.
Remember when the white to black wealth disparity had been pi to 1 in 1979? By 1989, that has skyrocketed to 17 to 1. We saw black homelessness triple in that decade, and we saw the highest black infant mortality rate that we had seen since the Great Depression. Our racist roots run deep. Over the next couple of decades, the nonprofit sector stabilized and then slowly began to grow. By 2020, we had 2.5 times more nonprofits than we had in 1990, and federal money had followed the same trajectory. But nonprofits hasn't changed the same racist practices that they had adopted in the 1980s. And so we really didn't see a lot of improvement in those racial disparities with lots of different outcomes until the pandemic era. So you'll know this story. COVID-19 put us in a tailspin. And like the New Deal era, like the Great Depression, our government responded by infusing money into nonprofits to try to stabilize the economy. And the nonprofit sector boomed. But unlike the New Deal era, this coincided with the Black Lives Matter movement, where we saw big racial justice efforts that changed policy and that changed practice across the country. It was a momentous time in our history. But now we've got big government and we've got racial justice happening at the same time, which sounds a whole lot like what was happening during the Great Society era. You know what happened then, so it's pretty predictable about what's going to happen now, which brings us to today. We're in it. The great privilege we have now is that this has happened before, and we can learn from our roots to decide, do we want to embrace what we did last time, or do we want to resist those roots that inform us today? One thing I learned from my research that can help us make some of this decision is one, we don't really care about big government and high taxes. We only care about big government and high taxes if those efforts aim to reduce racial disparities, especially for Black people. Number two, we are really good at doing racist things and not calling them racist. And number three, when we see racist policies passed, nonprofits and foundations fall in line. So this is our opportunity to resist those rates and to not fall in line this time. Nonprofits, we need to resist the urge to accept money that would make us change our practices in such a way that would exclude people. It is better to be smaller than it is to exclude the people who need you the most. And if we compromise our values, we will get used to that poison and we will never remember what values we ought before. We've proven it before. The change is permanent. And foundations, you need to fund the stuff that might get you in trouble and carry that risk yourself. Don't pass it on to nonprofits. We need foundations to be bold in this moment, not stand on the sidelines. And if you're still giving at the minimum amount that's required by law, you are still on the sidelines. Cowardice right now is poison. We know what the consequence is of not fixing the problem today. We know that infants will die. We know that people will experience poverty and homelessness. There is no greater call to action right now.
Yes, we have roots in racism, in slavery, that poison the fruit we see today. We saw it in redlining, Jim Crow. We saw it with the war on drugs in a thousand different ways. We see it in our cowardice today. But we also have roots in courage and in ingenuity. We have roots in resistance, like seeds woven into hair and hair braided into maps. We have roots in the ferocious defense of our freedom and of our children's freedom. We have roots in the fruit that produced the March on Washington and Black Lives Matter, lots of different efforts that have brought us to this justice today. We have roots in the fruit of institutions like NAACP, like the National Urban League, like YWCA. Our ancestors bled on this soil so that we could taste the fruits of justice. We have roots in the ferocious defense of justice because humanity must prevail. It can feel sometimes when we are surrounded by poison fruit that we don't have the option to choose justice. But we have always had the choice. Which fruit will you pick?